Good morning and welcome to the REF consultation webinar on staff and outputs. My name is Anna Lang and I am the Deputy Manager for the REF. Just a few housekeeping points to start. We'll run through a presentation on staff and outputs, and throughout the presentation we will pause with opportunities for questions on the content of the slides which have just been presented. If you'd like to ask a question, you'll see there's a box beneath your slide which says Ask Question. Can we ask if you please complete the email field accurately? If we receive a large number of questions through this morning's session, we may not have the opportunity to answer them all during the webinar, and we will reply to you following the session by email. So the webinar series are intended to allow those that were unable to come to our consultation events to hear about the REF consultation proposals and also understand a little bit more about the discussions that were had at some of these consultation events. So now we will be providing an overview of the key proposals related to staff and outputs today, but also reflecting on some of the feedback that we've already received through engagement with the sector. I'll now pass over to Kim Hackett to begin the first part of the presentation.
Thank you, Anna. Good morning. My name's Kim Hackett. I'm the REF Manager, and I'd like to start by just discussing some of the background context. So we launched our consultation on the 8th of December. The proposals in the consultation drew on two key sources. One was the range of evaluation activity that we undertook on the REF 2014 exercise, and the second was the recommendations made by the Stern Review. To touch briefly on the proposal, on the principles from the Stern Review, they were aiming towards an exercise which was overall reduced in burden for institutions particularly, one that addresses some of the key issues identified with previous exercises, particularly around issues such as the recruitment of staff around the census date. It aimed towards an exercise with an increased institutional focus, providing a more rounded view of research and giving recognition for investment made by institutions. It proposed an exercise with increased flexibility for institutions, giving space for longer-term research, and an also increased emphasis on interdisciplinary research, as well as broadening and deepening impact in the exercise. So that's some of the background to the Stern recommendations. The consultation sets out proposals in the key areas identified on this slide here. These are the issues we're consulting on in seeking how we can best implement the proposals, the recommendations from the Stern Review. We've so far had the opportunity to engage widely on our proposals through the consultation events that Anna has mentioned. We've held 5 of these events across the country. And we've also had the opportunity to speak with a range of different groups, such as subject groupings at speaking events that we've been invited to as well. These discussions we've had so far have been characterised by open discussion, in which a range of perspectives have been brought from different groups of staff, different types of institution, and different discipline areas. We found this to be very helpful from our perspective in informing us of the preliminary views emerging from the sector, areas of consensus. And also we've heard from institutions and participants at our events that these have been helpful for informing their own consultation responses.
We're having a number of comments coming through that people aren't seeing the slides moving on, although I don't think this is a problem for everybody. So if you are struggling to see the slides starting to move on, we recommend that you refresh your screen and then you should be able to see everything. We've also had reports that the sound is fine, so if you are struggling to hear us, it may be a problem at your end. Sorry to interrupt, Kim.
Okay, so I'm moving on from the features of the REF consultation slide. And you should now be able to see a webinar series slide. That's the current one. So as Anna mentioned, we're aiming to continue our engagement with this series of webinars, touching on the broad range of proposals that are in our consultation document. on Tuesday. We had discussion around the overall approach to the exercise, the unit of assessment structure, and appointment of panels and development of guidance. The aim for today is to focus on those proposals around staff and outputs, with our final webinar on Monday aiming to look at impact environment and the institutional level assessment. The webinar for today and Monday focus on some of the key areas that we've been exploring in the consultation events. We've had breakout groups on these areas in particular and have had a good level of discussion. So we're aiming to incorporate our views on that emerging feedback into the sessions on these topics. Okay, so I'd like to begin by discussing the proposals around submitting staff and outputs in the assessment. I'm going to begin with an overview of the package overall and what that might look like in terms of a submission process, including the feedback we've had on this overall package. But then I will take each element in turn, stopping for questions on each aspect as well to fully explore each of the proposals. So broadly then, what would the submission process look like according to the proposals? Step 1 would be to determine the number of outputs required for the submitting unit. This would require identifying the research active staff within cost centres and institutions, mapping these staff to the REF units of assessment, determining the average FTE of this staff in this UOA over a set period, which gives you an overall measure of volume, and multiplying that number by 2. That gives you the number of outputs required for that submitted unit. The second stage would then be to select the outputs for submission. This would include identifying the eligible outputs in the REF period, which are those demonstrably generated at the institution, selecting the outputs up to the number required, and ensuring that any research active staff member was not allocated to more than 6 per person. There would also be an additional step in ensuring a minimum of 1 was allocated to research active staff in the unit if a minimum is set at 1 rather than 0. But we will go on to explore each of these proposals in detail next. So overall, at the consultation events, it's been clear that delegates have seen how interconnected these proposals are. They need to be viewed as a package. In particular, the definition of research active staff is key to the understanding and operation of the remaining proposals in this area. Delegates were also reflecting on the impact that the proposals would have on the overall picture of the quality of UK research, given the differences in submissions, the volume of submissions between different types of institution and in different discipline areas. Delegates have also been reflecting on the equality and diversity implications arising from the proposals, and we will touch on this a little bit further as we go through each area in detail. There have also been questions around whether the burden associated with staff selection in previous exercises is simply being moved to the selection of outputs instead, particularly for those larger units where it's several hundred outputs that will need to be submitted. And they've also been returning back to key principles and discussing how the proposals fit with an exercise seeking to assess research excellence rather than research audit. So I'll move on now to start with the definition of research active staff and their mapping to HESA cost centres. We'll then stop for questions at that stage. So in our proposals, we're suggesting that research active staff is defined according to these HESA data, which are those staff returned to HESA on teaching and research or research-only contracts. It's our view that this is an existing source of data that's consistent across the sector, is auditable, and is of low burden. Our proposal is that staff are returned to units of assessment based on the HESA cost centre in which they're returned. There is a mapping of HESA cost centres to REF units of assessment that would indicate which unit of assessment staff would be returned into. Now, we've had feedback on both elements of these proposals at the consultation events and more widely. In particular, delegates have been exploring the boundaries of research active staff according to those HESA definitions explained. In particular, there's been a question raised about actually how fast staff contracts reflect actual activity within institutions. So, for instance, a number of staff on teaching and research contracts actually have more of a focus on knowledge exchange, or are perhaps engaged in professional practice or scholarly activity. For research-only contracts, there's a question around the inclusion or otherwise of research assistants and how we can reach a clear and audible definition of independence for that group of staff. In terms of the cost centre mapping, we've been hearing that the way staff are allocated to cost centres in HESA reflects a teaching purpose, not a REF purpose. This would in some cases lead to some odd-looking submissions, we've heard, for instance with just one staff member in some cost centres, or that where institutions want to submit the work of an interdisciplinary research centre in one unit of assessment, using HESA cost centres to map to UOAs would break this up and include the return of staff to multiple units of assessment. This may also make returning environment templates quite challenging. There's also concern that panels will not receive material for assessment within their remit. There's also been concern raised about the retrospective application of staff to units of assessment using HESA cost centre data. So we've been hearing suggestions for alternative ways that we can define research active staff or address some of the challenges raised by the HESA data. For instance, are there alternative ways that we can define research active that may be more helpful? For instance, is the concept of independence more relevant? Would it be useful to think about the HESA data collection and whether additional HESA fields may be an appropriate way to identify which staff are research active within institutions? And around the cost centres, is it more appropriate, we've been hearing, to allow institutions to decide where to submit, perhaps by using the overall figures and allowing institutions to reallocate within that overall number? Okay, so that summarises the proposals and some of the feedback we've been hearing on research active staff. We'll now stop and give an opportunity for questions. Before we do that, I will just run through our proposals, the remaining proposals on staff. Now, some of this does depend on what we take forward from the proposals outlined previously. But where staff are submitted, we're asking, should there be a staff identifier mandated, which is ORCID? And in terms of categories of eligible staff, we're asking, should we remove Category C staff as an eligible category in the assessment? Now, this reflects really the declining use of this category in previous exercises and the tightening of that definition, which actually reduced the number considerably in REF 2014. So we're asking, is that still a necessary category to have? We're also asking for how we can further improve the clarity of the definition of independence for research assistants, which we understand was difficult to implement in all cases in the previous assessment. And finally, we're also asking for views on whether we should ask for a relationship between staff on fractional appointments, that is 0.2 FTE, whether information should be submitted to determine their relationship with the submitting unit. So that would be a statement to describe how they are related to the submitting unit, and addresses, I think, some concern expressed in the previous exercise around staff employed for short periods of time on the minimum FTE requirement for submission, whose research actually had little to do with the submitting unit. But we are aware that in some discipline areas there is a much wider practice of having staff on this level of appointment, and it would not be our intention to introduce unfair requirements for those discipline areas. So we're seeking views on the best balance we can achieve there. In terms of feedback we've had on these areas, we have had more limited discussion. Discussion has been much more focused on questions around research active staff and the HESA cost centres. But we have had support for ORCID expressed, but I think there have also been questions around whether mandating the use of ORCID is an appropriate step. And there's also been some concern around the submission of NHS staff linked to the removal of Category C, particularly where we're seeking to promote collaboration between HE and beyond, and around the messages that the removal of this category might give, but also in line with the wider proposals where there was a joint appointment between HE and NHS, the outputs of those staff would be submissible, but we are welcoming views on the best approach here as well. So now we really are on to questions, and I shall hand back over to Anna.
Thanks, Kim. So we have received a large number of questions, and to make sure we're able to get through the content of the whole webinar, we probably won't be able to address them all now, but I'll make a start on some of them. One thing to say, we have had a number of people asking whether the slides will be available after the webinar. A full recording of the webinar will be available, along with the other recordings of the other webinars once the full series is complete. So these slides will be available as part of that. So to have a look at some of the questions. We have had a few comments which I think reflect some of the feedback we've already received with regards to the meaning of the definition of research active staff and the appropriateness of the teaching and research category within the HESA definition. So there's a few comments relating to the appropriateness of that, and I think so that's been covered, I think, in Kim's slides already. What else have we got in here? And again, some concern about using the HESA cost centres for that purpose of aligning to REF units of assessment. So some recognition for the feedback that we've already had. Somebody asking if we can say a little bit more about what is meant by independence. So I think for the last REF, the REF 2014, where staff were returned to HESA with a research-only contract and flagged as research assistants, they were only eligible to be returned where they were considered to be independent. And the definition for the last REF was that they had to be named as a PI or co-I on a grant or equivalent. The feedback we had from that was that wasn't always that clear and wasn't a definition that was suitable for all subject areas. So we're actually asking in the consultation how we might better define independence. And we have had some discussions about the suitability or the appropriateness of thinking about the independence of all research active staff that are returned to the REF. Kim, I don't know if you want to say a bit more about that.
Yes, I mean, I think this is pertinent to two areas. One is, as Anna mentioned, in relation to the process identified in 2014 for ascertaining whether staff could be returned to the assessment. I think it's turned on its head a little bit with the proposals for submitting staff and outputs in the next exercise, actually around identifying that boundary of where staff oughtn't to be included in the FTE number to determine the number of outputs required. So I think it's a slightly different balance that we're exploring here, but important one to get right nonetheless.
Okay. One quite pointed question. Why is it seen as desirable or necessary to the REF for all research active staff to be submitted? which I think is a reflection of Lord Stern's recommendations, really. So, a number of the proposals in the consultation document are intended to implement the recommendations of Lord Stern. And Lord Stern recommended that all research active staff be returned as a result of comments from the sector that and our own evaluation work that showed that the cost and burden and process of having to select staff was difficult. There was stigma around those staff that were and were not returned, and was a costly and burdensome process. So that is why a proposal for all research active staff is being considered at the moment. We have a question: why is a HESA ID not suitable and ORCID suggested? So our understanding is that HESA IDs often change, don't necessarily carry with the individual across their research career. They're used slightly interchangeably by different institutions, so sometimes they will create a new HESA ID for an individual when they may have had one in the past. So the robustness of a HESA ID to use systematically across all submissions has been questioned. So that's one of the reasons that we're exploring that. Let me have a look at a few. I'll just see if there's any more that we can address quickly. Would research assistants, PGRAs, research fellows, etc. be included in the academic FTE figure? So this is, I think, we'll include those that meet this definition of research active in that figure rather than the total pool of staff at the institution. So that's where we need to get the definition of research active staff right. I think the intention is that the FTE figure that is established is an appropriate one for research active staff that are independent.
Yes, exactly. It comes back again to this this issue around establishing who are independent researchers.
Okay. There are a few more questions, but with the time that we have, I think we'll move on to the next section. Those that have not had their questions answered so far, as I mentioned at the beginning, we will email you with responses separately. So we're now moving on to decoupling staff and outputs. So the premise behind the next REF is that the link between staff and outputs is loosened as far as possible. And this is then based on Lord Stern's principle that the REF should be more institutionally focused and less about directly about the individuals. So the premise is that, based on Kim's earlier graphic, which shows that what we're trying to do is establish an FTE, a volume measure, on which the total the total number of outputs for each unit of assessment should be based. So this FTE figure, rather than all individuals with a number of outputs directly attached to them, is with this intention to decouple staff and outputs. So the proposals in the consultation proposed that a multiplier of 2 outputs is applied to this FTE that is established for each unit of assessment, and that total number of outputs required is then built up on a flexible number of outputs per staff. So as opposed to an average or a maximum of 4 outputs per person in the last REF, the number of outputs related to the FTE or the staff attached to that unit of assessment could be from 0 or 1 as a minimum and up to a maximum of 6 outputs. And the consultation events have explored issues around this multiplier of 2 and what a minimum and maximum number of outputs should be and how this might represent the unit of assessment as a whole. So some of the feedback we've had around this are thinking about what the effect might be, firstly, of the multiplier of 2 outputs. So as you can see on the slide, it mentions bunching at the top end, and the feedback we've had is that this is a reflection of those institutions that returned a high proportion of the research active staff last time. A multiplier of 2 could have the effect of actually reducing the number of outputs that they have to return, and therefore lead to less differentiation between their scoring at the top end if they can almost be more selective about the outputs that are returned. Moving on to the flexibility of outputs, the maximum of 6 outputs for some staff raised some questions about what this might mean for research stars, and if this puts additional pressure on certain members of a department to produce 6 outputs. So although the flexibility around outputs is intended to give more scope for an institution to pick those outputs across the board and detach them from outputs, there is some concern that there might become additional pressure on certain individuals to produce more outputs. And so that's some of the feedback that's been coming through. On equality and diversity, so this flexibility around the number of outputs that are returned as a total for the unit of assessment could mean that there removes the need for individual self-circumstances in the way they were used for REF 2014. So in the last REF, there could be a reduction of outputs for individuals that had circumstances which had constrained their ability to produce research. This would be removed in this exercise if there was a flexibility to return fewer outputs for such individuals without requesting this individual staff information. But we do think there is a need for a code of practice around the selection processes. We had a question before the webinar start related to that and what this code of practice might look like. I think that depends a little bit on what decisions are made around the submission processes, what this volume measure that determines the number of outputs is based on. But a lot of the feedback we've had through the events is that some of the good work that was done in relation to equality and diversity in the last REF shouldn't be lost, and we need to find a way in the next REF to ensure that that good work continues. We recognise that the individual staff circumstances measures, particularly around complex circumstances for REF 2014, were seen to be highly burdensome, but that there were also led to some good practices and good cultural changes within institutions. So we need to try and find the recommendations that we need to try and find a balance between those two angles to ensure that institutions are still encouraged to ensure that there are fair practices for all staff that have a number of circumstances that are affecting their ability to work productively. So we welcome your feedback in the consultation on how this might best be addressed and what measures the REF might put forward to support this. We have also had this suggestion around the environment template and the extent to which there might be a need to ensure that the number of outputs returned for a unit of assessment are representative of the unit as a whole. This is particularly if the 0 outputs is chosen as a minimum. So there was probably marginally more support for it being 0 rather than 1 output per staff member, allowing a little bit more flexibility. I think one of the reasons that this 0 was preferred was some nervousness around the definition of research active staff. And so if the definition of research active staff is fairly broad, the feedback we had was institutions would feel more comfortable that it was possible to have 0 outputs attached to some of those individuals. Although there was therefore concern, even by those that supported this 0 as a minimum, about what it might say in terms of the representativeness of that submission and about the sector as a whole. And therefore there was a suggestion made that through the environment there might be a need for the unit of assessment to explain how those outputs represent the unit and what kind of part of the research and how they represent all of the staff that are returned. So I imagine we've had a few questions. I know we had earlier on this issue, so I'll pass back to Kim to go over some of them.
Thanks, Anna. We have had a few questions in this area. I'll start with questions around decoupling. So a couple here actually probing a little bit further on what actually decoupling means. Is it something that's achievable? Outputs are produced by people, after all. So I think to go back to the principles here, this is around assessing units and in an effort to put more of an institutional focus on the assessment. The proposals actually ask you to think about turning the process of submission on its head a little bit and starting out with the slide that we had earlier illustrating the proposals. the suggestion actually is that you start by generating a number, essentially, a volume of activity, and from that determine the number of outputs you submit. But as has been identified across our consultation events, some of the boundaries that we are suggesting we introduce around decoupling staff and outputs in the submission, particularly around a minimum and a maximum, do limit the extent to which we have true decoupling, and in an effort to address some of the potential equality and diversity implications of that. But in this question we have, will a scale of, in effect, 0 to 6 outputs per person mean there will be a stigma if researcher A had fewer outputs submitted than researcher B? I think that's a valid question to consider in relation to actually does the stigma of not being submitted to the REF simply be translated to how many outputs you had submitted in the REF in the new exercise. And we've also had comments and concerns raised around the effect that this might have within departments for individuals who are star researchers or become such because of the number of outputs they may have attached to them, or actually the burden that may then be upon such individuals, particularly in smaller units where there is increased burden upon them to produce, perhaps where there are staff within the unit who are less able to publish productively throughout the period. So I think it's a really interesting matter for further consideration. We have had suggestions, as Anna outlined, around completely decoupling and using another mechanism to look at the representativeness of submissions. So we're very interested in your views around that as well. Okay, so we have had further comments and questions as well on the maximum and minimum suggestions. One asks, how is it proposed to count the maximum number of outputs per person? Is it being named on 6 papers, or is some measure of contribution required? I think this is a really interesting question and relates also to some wider comments we've had about co-authorship and how that might work in the proposals. I think it's important to say that some of this isn't nailed down yet and will depend actually on the decisions around other aspects of the proposals as well. But certainly, I think what we need to do is ensure fairness across units for institutions submitting. So, for instance, if you are able to submit 2 outputs within different UOAs, which is essentially an artificial discipline-based structure where there are co-authored outputs, it would seem unfair then not to be able to submit multiple outputs, the same output more than once within the UOA where there were two different staff members involved. But I think the allocation suggested in the document, the allocation of outputs to staff, is intended to limit the dominance of one or a small number of members of staff within the unit, but not to act as a counter to collaborative or multidisciplinary work in the assessment. Anything else to add to that, Anna?
No, I think that's fair enough. And well, I think it's reflecting that we will also be consulting with the panels when they're formed to inform some of our approaches to that, where there may be a need for disciplinary discussions. Okay, we've also had some questions around the partial fractional contracts, so 0.2 contracts, and their relationship to the minimum and maximum, which is, again, a point that has been raised more widely, particularly in relation to a maximum and whether that should actually relate to the size of contract. So, for instance, you wouldn't have a maximum of 6 outputs for staff on 0.2 contract, but actually that could be
done in proportion to the contract size. That's an interesting proposal and one that needs to be thought through carefully, and we welcome your views on those issues and whether that's an appropriate approach for future. Okay, the final question I'm going to answer is when you say that the FTE volume will be calculated using the average FTE over the period, what period are you referring to? That's a good question and one that has been commented on. So we say in the document a set period and do not specify what set period this is. The feedback that we've had from the consultation events on this point is that it couldn't be earlier than the point at which the initial decisions are made. So, for instance, we could not ask institutions retrospectively to include FTE for years in the assessment period that have now passed. So we're interested in your views on what the effect of so doing would be in particular, and in a sense to balance that value of having an average FTE volume, which would, for instance, allow units who've got a range of newer staff in post to particularly with non-portability of outputs, which we'll move on to next, to have some flexibility in assessment against returning to the use of the census date as we have done in previous assessments. Okay, so I think we'll leave it there for a minute. We have had further questions, but just to say that we will be answering those by correspondence if we haven't been able to do so here. Okay, so moving on then to talk about non-portability. So this is a proposal which presents a departure from previous exercises. So it's important, I suppose, to start off with going back to the principles here. This is about providing recognition for investment by institutions in the generation of research outputs. So the proposal, the recommendation in Stern, is that outputs should be eligible for submission by the institution where they were demonstrably generated. So primarily, this is around giving the recognition for institution investment, but also to address some of the evidence that we've received in relation to previous exercises about the effect of the exercise on staff recruitment around the census date, as well as on staff salaries at that time. So what we're proposing in the consultation is that demonstrably generated is defined according to the date at which outputs were accepted for publication, and that those outputs are therefore eligible to be returned by that institution. We recognise that this is a challenging concept for a number of reasons, particularly for discipline areas with outputs that are perhaps non-text-based, which the concept of acceptance for publication doesn't really have much meaning, as well as for different output types. So monographs, for instance, where the date of acceptance for publication is not necessarily something that can be easily pinned down. So we've had reflections on some of those challenges by delegates at our consultation events, as well as around the practical challenges for institutions in managing and auditing some of this, particularly where staff have left the institution. There have also been reflections on the effects and implications. So in particular, concerns have been raised about early career researchers who tend to be on shorter fixed-term positions, and concerns are raised about the extent to which their mobility may be affected by this proposal. That sort of relates to a wider concern about the overall effect on mobility in the sector of this proposal, as well as upon different types of behaviour that may result, effects on perhaps publishing behaviour if researchers were to hold on to research for publication until they've made a move, if that's what they're thinking of doing. There's also been concerns raised about particular groups of staff, such as those who are made redundant by an institution, and ethical concerns really about whether such an institution could then return those outputs by that staff member for assessment. Wider than that, there has been support for the principle in practice of giving institutions recognition for investment, and delegates have been exploring alternatives to this approach. For instance, perhaps both institutions are allowed to submit outputs where a member of staff has moved during the assessment period, but that also raises sort of concerns about the practical implications really around the extent to which institutions would have to liaise during the assessment period, or the complexity around introducing such a measure. There have also been suggestions around using the date of publication instead of acceptance for publication as a marker that's much easier to pin down and audit. Okay, so that summarises the proposals and feedback we've had on non-portability. I think we are now moving on to some more questions. Anna?
Yes, we are. We've had a huge number of questions across all of the issues, so you may have to bear with us slightly while we wade through some of them and make sure that I can address at least some of them for you. So we had a question: what is the perceived benefit of portability? Is it just to stop game playing? Why couldn't the previous employer submit a previous staff member's outputs at their HCI as well as the new employer, so both are happy? So I think the perceived benefits of non-portability, I think Kim would have addressed this slightly, but do relate to this concept of a staff transfer market. And I think as part of Lord Stern's evidence gathering, he received a number of comments about the perverse consequences of the REF timetable and what this might do in terms of encouraging people to move institutions, or the hike in salaries created for institutions by trying to retain staff so that they're not lost close to the end of the period. There are some other perceived benefits of non-portability in relation to how this might affect recruitment practices, with the need to encourage institutions to recruit staff on the basis of their potential rather than simply the outputs that they're selecting for the REF. I think some of the feedback through the events that we found was that actually a lot of recruitment is based on future potential. So those are some of the benefits, but I think through the events we recognize, and a lot of people were supportive of those principles, but some of the feedback was really about how we implement that in practice. So another question, how does a minimum number of outputs work per person with non-portability? If the person has left, who do we associate their outputs with? So this relates back to the kind of decoupling question and how staff are related to their outputs. So if we were to use that total FTE that's created from an average across the sector, all of the staff which had been employed by that institution could well be listed against their submission even if they have left, therefore meaning that there is a link between that output and the person. Through the events, the non-portability issue, and I think we recognise this across a number of the staff and output questions, that they are really interlinked, and there's a lot of overlap in terms of the consequences depending on which decision you make on which point. But another reason for the support for zero outputs was linked to the non-portability, and if that does indeed come into case, then a zero number of outputs was preferred. Kim, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that linking of outputs with staff that have already left the institution.
Yes, I mean, I think as Anna has suggested, there were a sort of lot of concern around the practically managing doing this where staff have left, particularly where you've you're required to provide a minimum of one for each member of staff. So that is certainly something that needs considering, and the effects really, outlined in evidence in detail for us in your responses.
Yeah. So a final question on portability to enable us to get through the rest of the slides for the rest of this session. A question: my concern is that portability will lead to people not moving jobs and essentially blocking jobs. Is this something that's been considered? It is feedback we've received that introducing non-portability will affect natural staff mobility and might not be for the good of the sector as a whole, and we welcome further comments and consequences that you envisage as a result of this as part of your consultation responses, really. So I think non-portability is a key one where we would really welcome your thoughts on the potential consequences and what alternatives or options there might be for implementing it in a different way.
Yeah, including particularly around the practical implications for alternatives, such as sharing outputs between institutions where staff have moved. So really interested in your views on how that might affect the practice.
So we're now moving on to a slide relating to interdisciplinary research. Excuse me. As part of Lord Stern's recommendations and his overarching principles, he was keen to encourage interdisciplinary research further for REF 2021. This is on the premise that there may have been a perception that interdisciplinary research was somehow disadvantaged in the previous exercise, both in terms of impact and research outputs themselves. In this session, we'll focus more so on interdisciplinary research outputs. Interdisciplinary impact will be addressed in our final webinar taking place on Monday. So some of our proposals around how we might encourage and facilitate the submission of interdisciplinary research are outlined on this slide. We recognise that with a disciplinary structure on which the REF is based, there are certain kind of underpinning structures which we need to try and get past or at least add to help enhance and enable institutions to feel comfortable in submitting their interdisciplinary research. So first of all, we have proposed the introduction of interdisciplinary champions. These would be individuals that sit on the sub-panels and main panels to oversee or be aware of the interdisciplinary research that is being returned and ensure it is being assessed in a fair way, and that it is being, if necessary, cross-referred or discussed across a number of units of assessment which may have an interest in the research that underpins that output. Related to this, we're proposing mandating the IDR research identifier. This was an optional field for REF 2014, which provided institutions with the option to flag those outputs that they considered to be interdisciplinary. By mandating this field, it would allow the panels to more easily see interdisciplinary research and so enable the interdisciplinary champions to undertake their role more effectively. It would also enable us to gather further evidence on the submission of interdisciplinary research. Our analysis of those outputs flagged as interdisciplinary in the last time showed that use of this flag was somewhat sporadic across institutions, but on the whole, for those that were flagged as interdisciplinary, the range of quality scores and assessment was comparable with all other output types. So none of our evidence suggests there was any disadvantage, but that it is based on a limited range of outputs because, as I said, this flag wasn't widely used. Our proposals also suggest that there might be a role for the environment template, allowing institutions to draw attention to their interdisciplinary work and the ways in which their research centres and strategies help support this kind of research. As well as this, we're looking to appoint an interdisciplinary research advisory panel. Athene Donald from Cambridge University has been appointed as chair of this panel, and we are in the process of gathering nominations for panel members so that this panel can be fully functioning and support and be a go-to group for us to support our analysis of the consultation responses when they're provided. So that outlines our proposals. Some of the feedback we've had through our conversations so far are that there's actually relatively limited support for champions and for mandating the use of this identifier. And this was somewhat based on a kind of an underlying uncertainty about the treatment of interdisciplinary research and exactly what role these champions would have. So I think the sector kind of was seeking further clarity before they were prepared to commit to some of the proposals we were making. And this is somewhat based on the relatively loose definition of interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary research. I've kind of used the term interdisciplinary research, and it's used widely across the REF consultation document, almost as a catch-all statement, really. We're aware of the wide debate and wide conversation across the community in recent years as to what exactly is meant by interdisciplinary research. And the feedback from the events did suggest that this definition would need to be tied down somewhat for the REF. There was some concern about imposing any artificial quotas, so a request for a certain amount of the submission to be interdisciplinary, and how this might artificially impose either limits or expectations on interdisciplinary research, where institutions felt this was more organic and should be down to them and their autonomy in terms of how it's created and supported. As Kim will have reflected at the start when we were discussing HESA cost centres and how they mapped units of assessment, this also touches on how that might be counter to supporting interdisciplinary research, and using cost centres to map units of assessment might cover up some broader interdisciplinary work and research centres which might choose to submit to one unit of assessment, but by cost centre mapping would prevent that. So that's some of the feedback we've had so far on interdisciplinary research. I think we've probably got time for one or two questions.
Yeah, there's a couple of issues I'd like to address here. So one around the actual evidence. Have we got any evidence that the interdisciplinary research outputs were not fairly treated? Just to really flag up, as Anna outlined, the evidence we had around the outputs that were flagged as interdisciplinary certainly showed no difference in treatment of those outputs. However, some quantitative analysis we did following the exercise suggests there may be an issue around submission and the confidence to submit these types of outputs. So the measures that we're proposing to introduce for the next REF are again aimed at really giving confidence to institutions to submit this type of research and that it will receive fair assessment in the exercise. So following on from that, I think there's a couple of questions around what the flag, if mandated, is actually intended to do. One asks, is it intended to be used to flag cross-UOA submissions only and not interdisciplinary research within a UOA? And the answer really to that question is that we're intending, the proposal suggests to identify interdisciplinary research, so it would be all types of research that institutions feel meet this broad definition, in order to flag it up, particularly if we're having interdisciplinary champions on the panels, for example, to flag it up to those members of the panels and to allow us to examine its treatment and assessment throughout the process. Okay, I think time is marching on, so we will leave it there, but we'll seek to answer as many as we can at the end if we've any time. Okay, so the final area that we want to touch on today are our proposals around metrics in the assessment, the use of additional data to support the panel's assessment. So as set out in our consultation document, as indicated by the metric TIDE review in 2015, and also as recommended by Lord Stern, the REF will continue to be based on peer review. Regarding the assessment of outputs, we are going to work with the Forum for Responsible Metrics to explore what additional data can be provided to the subpanels to support their assessment of outputs. This would be data that's appropriate for the discipline to enhance that provided in 2014. For instance, whether field-weighted citation impact would be an appropriate indicator to provide to the panels. So we have had, again, reasonably limited discussion of this issue. There's general support for the exercise being based on peer review. There are some concerns around how additional data would be used and seeking to balance really risks around misuse versus the value that it could provide in supporting the assessment. So to that end, it would be important that panels are involved closely in the decisions around what data are provided for assessment. There's also been the suggestion that additional panel guidance and training should be provided, again, really around the concerns around the misuse of such data. We, as I said, are going to work with the Forum for Responsible Metrics on this issue as well. They are also going to provide us with guidance on developing data for other parts of the assessment, such as the environment template as well, and we'll come back to that on Monday in our next webinar. But the Forum for Responsible Metrics have been considering the issues around what data should be provided to subpanels and the panel role in that, and their response on a number of these issues will be available shortly on their website. So I would encourage you all with an interest in this area to have a look at that document. I think it's due in the next week or so.
Yeah, so that will be on the UUK website. Yeah, I think we're waiting for it to be published any time.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of our formal presentation on the issues we want to discuss with you today. We've got a final couple of minutes for questions before I'll hand over again to Anna to wrap up.
We actually haven't had any questions on metrics, which is good. So I wonder whether we rattle through the last couple of slides, and I'm conscious that we're due to finish at 11 o'clock. We've had over 100 people attend this webinar, which may be reflected in the number of questions that we have received. And I think, so although we will do our best to reply to them all individually, I think because of the large number of questions, we will also try and make those questions and answers publicly available at the same time or around the time that the webinars are published. So you'll be able to see the different questions and responses across all those that have contributed to this webinar. I've just been told there were 141 attended. I think that's probably a record for a HEFCE webinar, but don't quote me. So just to summarise our next steps and for the REF consultation period. So it's a 14-week consultation period to reflect the vast number of questions that are included in the document, and the deadline feels like it's fast approaching as midday on Friday the 17th of March. Once we've received all of the responses using the formal SMART survey form to provide your responses, we will start to analyse all of those internally across the REF team and funding bodies. So this will happen through the spring and summer. The governance structure for the REF means that this will need all of the initial decisions, so the outcomes of the consultation, will need to be discussed with the REF steering group, which has representatives of the 4 UK funding bodies, and formally approved by the chief executive or equivalent of each funding body and their associated boards. So this will lead to publication of initial decisions in summer 2017. These initial decisions are intended to address some of the high-level principles detailed in the consultation proposals themselves, and not the kind of the formal guidance which will follow after. So as we've mentioned through a number of the slides in this session, there are a number of advisory panels listed on this slide, which we will seek advice from throughout our consultation analysis to help formulate our final decisions, and also determine any pilot activity that also needs to take place through the end of this year. We expect the pilot activity to be focused around the institutional level assessment, which we'll address a little bit more in the webinar on Monday. So I will close with this final slide, which is the REF2021 Timetable and shows how we intend to progress and how this compares with the timetable for REF2014. With guidance documents expected in 2018, the submissions system and submissions phase therefore in 2019-20, and the panel assessment of all submissions in 2021, with outcomes published in December of the same year. We're now on 11 o'clock, so I'll pass to Kim to close.
Thanks, Anna. We've had one question around the timings and place for where the webinars are going to be made available, so I'd just like to ask my colleague Claire to answer that question.
Hello everybody, my name's Cara. I'm part of the research team at HEFCE. I've been dealing with the questions, so you haven't heard from me yet today. The webinar recordings and the slide packs for each of the webinars will be available on the research policy pages on our website. So the section with the second excellence framework and the consultation events tab within that, and they will be uploaded after the final one on Monday, so I checked, say, on Wednesday for those to be live.
So that's the same place as you'll find the consultation document information on the HEFCE website, isn't it? Great.
Thanks, Claire. So it's just down to me now to thank you all very much for listening and engaging us with your questions today. It's been helpful for us as always, and we look forward to discussing with you again on Monday.
Thank you.